junior college should be free. Four-year state colleges should be very, very.
Okay, I gotta let people in.
Happy birthday, Mary.
Thank you.
Hi, Meredith. Did you enjoy your birthday afternoon?
Yes, yes, I did.
Very good.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to session 2 of Together and Apart, our Hartman Institute iEngage class for adult education at Beth Shalom. We were off last week so that we could give an opportunity for everyone to participate in community game night, and I hope you availed yourselves of that if that's your thing. And if not, I hope you use the time to either take care of yourselves, look back on what we discussed, or maybe even to get ahead. Tonight, we're going to cover 2 units worth of material, but I will tell you, as I did before, by implication, the 2 units go well together. And in fact, I taught the 2 units yesterday, and I had a little bit of extra time. I had extra time, though, because there weren't people who wanted to share their Israel story. So let me first share with you the agenda so you can see what the plan is for tonight. And then we'll see who would like to maybe share who or what most influenced their Israel story. Okay, so welcome. And then we're going to get to not everybody, definitely not everybody, but a few volunteers sharing a little bit about, what most impacts the way you think about and relate to Israel. Then we're going to just recall, for reference sake, this whole idea of the 2 homes, namely Israel and North America. But we're going to relate them to each of the 2 units, where Israel is a form of Judaism as being, and North America is a form of Judaism as becoming. They're not mutually exclusive, but for the purposes of class, we're going to kind of think about them that way. I termed those 2 kinds of Judaisms as a Judaism of ethics and beliefs. So we're going to first look at each model separately, go through some sources from the Torah all the way to pretty close to the present day, actually. Some of our sources reach a very contemporary Jewish material. Then we'll go back to the whole Israel North America thing and see if these 2 Judaisms are indeed helpful in terms of how we think about Israel and North America as 2 different homes, and how maybe it's not so helpful and we need to kind of move beyond that. The degree to which we do think about them as something we can learn from. What are the pros and cons? So that'll be D. Okay, and then we're gonna take a couple minutes to make sure everyone's ready for the next class. Any questions before we begin? Scroll through pictures. Looks like we're okay. Okay, so let me stop sharing, and Anyone interested or willing to volunteer to tell their Israel story? Who or what most influenced your Israel story? I see Carol and Josh and Lori. Perfect. So let's just go in that order. Carol Brown, you're on. You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So this is a great question, because when I got thinking about this, something came back to me from when I literally was in Gimel in Hebrew school. So that was like 60 years ago. And we lived in Bethesda then. It was before my dad got transferred to the Philadelphia area, where we lived in Elkins Park, Melrose Park area. And I went to Hebrew school at Bethel, and we had an assembly, and my Hebrew school teacher that year, I still remember her name even, she was sitting next to me at the end of the row. And at the end of the ceremony, they played the Hatikvah, and we all sang. And all of a sudden, she started crying, beyond crying. She was bawling. She was beside herself, had her hands over her face, and was just hysterical. And, as a 9 or 10-year-old, you weren't exactly sure how to handle it, what to do. I just said to her, Mrs. Pincus, are you okay? No, I miss my homeland so badly. I miss my homeland. And like I said, I thought about this. This came back to me. It just resonated with me. And she wasn't able to escort our class back to the classroom. Somebody else needed to take over. She was beside herself. And I just thought, wow, like Israel, it was so powerful. And then we went over there in 2007. It was our son, who had gone to Northwestern for undergrad. Between his years of undergrad and medical school there, he went to Israel to study abroad, and he had a great experience. And he was there for 5 months, and he wanted to take the whole family back and kind of tour us around and show us. And I just remember landing. We took El Al over and landing, and it was very emotional. It was unbelievable landing on that ground and on the soil. And I'm not going to go into the details because I want to let other people talk, but it was an amazing couple weeks. We were there over Passover. And it was the first time I had ever eaten in a restaurant over Passover. So that was an experience in itself, being able to eat out for Passover. So it was great.
Excellent. Before I turn it over to Josh, I have to ask, because it's relevant to this ongoing conversation we're having. When you landed at Ben Gurion, did you see other people bend down and kiss the ground?
Yes.
Right.
And a lot of people crying, and it was a very emotional experience that I'll never forget.
It's not something we always see, particularly now that airports are so modern. And depending on when you first went to Israel, the terminal did not connect to the airplanes, right? You would have to actually exit onto the tarmac and then take a bus to the terminal. And so it used to be kind of like everybody would kiss the ground, or almost everybody. But now it's just a little bit more rare. So I'm glad I asked you, and I'm glad you got to at least witness it if you yourself didn't partake. Josh, why don't you share your story?
I don't even know where to start and how to keep it short, because it's just, if you had asked me this a week ago, it would be totally different, because one of the people most influential in my Israel story died on Tuesday. And I spent 2 hours this afternoon on a Zoom with about 500 other people from Young Judea, Zionist movement that
Mhm.
my parents and my grandparents were members of. My first trip to Israel when I was 5 years old for my grandmother's unveiling. My grandparents, both sets of grandparents, but my paternal grandparents were lifelong Zionists. My grandfather died just a few weeks before the state of Israel was born. And then his recent widow then made Aliyah and spent the last 20 years of her life in Sfat, an artist colony. So my first trip to Israel was for her unveiling. My dad had gone like totally on. My first real strong memory of my whole life was the telegram that she had died. So my father got on a plane by himself, and the rest of the family went for the unveiling a year or so later. Between the ages of 18 and 26, I spent 2.5 years in Israel together. Young Judea year course, which is a very structured, spent time, a lot of learning, enough to get college credit for the year, and a lot of sightseeing and spending time in kibbutz, moshav, development town. If you don't know what a development town is, sort of like, think of a housing project in a major city in the United States and think of a whole city just of that. I mean, they've expanded and added things since then, but the initial concept was just a city of a housing project to help new immigrants, initially from North Africa and then Russia and Ethiopia and so forth. And then two other, I won't take up time getting into the details of the other trips, but coming from a multi-generational Zionist family, it always seemed like a natural thing to see Israel as a second home. I didn't have an epiphany about it. It wasn't like, Israel, I didn't know about this place. Now I do. It was always sort of like literally in my blood. As I said, my father spent 6 years in the shtetl of Tel Aviv in the 1930s as a young boy. It was only like 15 years after it was founded or something like that. So that's the abbreviated version of my Israel story.
Thank you for sharing and for trying to make it concise. Can I ask who the young Judea person who influenced you, the name of the person who passed?
His name was Mel Reedsfield, and the funny thing is, one of the leaders, or formerly, I'm not sure what his position is, but you know Gil Troy?
Yes.
He wrote, his eulogy was on the front page of the Jerusalem Post yesterday or today, whichever,
Got it. All right, so I will look for that. So just again, for the thread, right? We can be exposed to somebody who experienced Israel very much as a homeland and a land and a place, like a very physical, special place, and also through family, right? We have the idea of our connection. And Lori, would you please share your story? Who or what most influenced your Israel story?
So when you asked that question, the one person came into my mind was my great aunt Haya. So she's her husband and my grandfather were brothers. And my grandfather had left the Poland, Russia, Austria, that area in there before World War I, and then my grandmother came over after World War I. Okay, and my mom was born here in the States. My Aunt Haya, I guess her Samuel, would have been my great uncle, who I never met. My grandfather, my great uncle, went to Israel, and he met Haya in Israel, and they then came to the U.S. and lived here for a little while, and then they went back to Israel, and they had a son who, and I'm still close with that family. But Aunt Haya, when I was about 4 or 5, came from, probably her husband had already passed by then, came to America and stayed with us for a month. She took a cruise ship, which is how people traveled then. And so she was my relative from Israel. But the other piece was, which gets this homeland thing, is I remember her showing me a picture, and it was a picture of a whole family in front of a piano. And this was her family from Austria, maybe Vienna. And she showed me the picture and showed me where she was. And she said, everybody else died. Her whole family died in the Holocaust, but she was able to get to Israel. And like the story is that they actually owned orange groves that for some reason they sold. Had they not sold them, they would have been, but they lived in this area called Herzliya. And I was there 2 summers ago, and her daughter-in-law was saying to me, you could see the ocean, you could see the Mediterranean from their house that was up on this hill. And now it's a whole line of offices like Microsoft, every high-techy thing is there. But anyhow, when you asked that question, it was this influence of meeting Chaya from Israel and the story of the Holocaust that's combined. And that's what I remember. When I went over in the 80s, I stayed with my cousin Murray, her son. And then when I went, I stayed with her granddaughter, who's around my age. When we went this past time, we stayed with her for a week and visited family. But anyhow, so that's my story.
Thank you for sharing. And
Jeremy froze.
I didn't mean to stun him.
Okay, well, while Jeremy's unfreezing, my dad wanted to share.
Well, my story is in 1948, I was 18, and I was consular at a Jewish camp run by the Jewish Federation in Chicago. And at the end of the camp season, a whole bunch of the consulars and staff were going to Israel to join the IDF. And I had considered it, but I was in pre-med, and I decided not to go. And I've always wondered how my life would have been different if I had gone to Israel at that time. But 70 years later, my grandson went to Israel and joined the IDF. So that's the story.
I apologize for the internet mix-up. I'm going to change a few settings in my house and see if that helps. What I was saying when I got cut off, so I'm sorry, Jerry, for if I'm interrupting you, but I heard the tail end, and we wish Jordan not just the safe travels back to Israel, but protection and success in his service in the IDF. What I was saying is that
Uh-oh. I think we have another freeze. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm,
Yes.
Yeah,
I
we
might
can hear
as
you. I
well.
don't know what happened to Jeremy though.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I might as well give my
Everybody will fill in. Yes.
just all right. My experience started, I guess, with my parents, of course, but then Hebrew school at Beth Shalom. I may be one of the few people on this call who attended Hebrew school at Beth Shalom. And I can remember Gabe Cohen, who was Israeli, who was the principal. And I can remember Joe Byer, who had fought in the War of Independence. And of course, I had the childlike impressions of Israel and JNF. That continued, and then always had a connection, I felt. And then Marilyn and I went in 1972 to Israel. And I can recall I didn't kiss the ground when I got to the country, but I can say that when I walked into Jerusalem and we looked at the Kotel, such emotions really overcame. I was overcome with emotion. It was my identification. But I think the person who really helped solidify my love of Israel and my recognition of the need for Israel was a fellow by the name of Gil Spiegel. Gil, may he rest in peace, lived in Wilmington. He ran a title agency. And when I had my first office, I opened it up in August of 1973, and we all know what happened a couple of months later with the Yom Kippur War. Now, my office was an interior office, and I couldn't get good radio reception. We didn't have the internet back then. But Gil's office, he had an office two floors above me, was an exterior office. So Gil invited me up, and we had long conversations as the war was going on, and we became more and more concerned about whether Israel would continue to exist. And it helped me realize the importance of Israel to me, especially considering that my father left what became the Soviet Union, and a lot of my family was killed during pogroms and then afterwards in the Holocaust. So the appreciation of Israel as being the place that as a Jew we could go was really, it hit home back in 1973.
So I'll jump in until Rabbi Winaker comes back. You would hope
I'm
that-
gonna call him right now and see what's going on.
Good, Marla, thanks. So you would hope that the rabbi who leads your congregation would have an affectionate and deep commitment to Israel. So don't worry, I do. But I'd studied at the American University in Washington, D.C. for my master's in international relations. And my professors were either Arabs or Arabists. And my papers were very pro-Palestinian. They weren't anti-Israel, but they were pro-Palestinian. My parents freaked out and they said, we better send him to Israel to fix him. So they're going to send me to 2 weeks to fix me. And I said, I can't go for 2 weeks and be fixed. I need to go for a year to be fixed. And I said, well, we don't have any money. I said, I'll find a scholarship. And I did. I found a scholarship and I went for a year. And one of the benefits of going was I met all sorts of people. I certainly met people on the left, but I met people who lived in settlements and I saw what a settlement looks like. And I realized it doesn't look like something from the wild, wild west that looks very temporary or very Alamo-esque, or the word settlement is such a misnomer about what the structures are. And I met just people with all sorts of experiences. And I think what really connected me to Israel and keeps me connected were my friendships, not just friendship of Israelis, who I treasured, but friendship of American Jews who were serious about their Judaism, serious Reform Jews, serious conservative Jews, serious modern Orthodox Jews who didn't do the yeshiva track at Yeshiva University, but went to the more secular Hebrew University. And a lot of those friends of mine from my one-year program at Hebrew University were actually my not best man, but the bridal, the groomsmen at my wedding. And I've kept my friendships up. And when I chose to come here to Congregation Beth Shalom over 16 years ago, a lot of my friends from my Hebrew U program, the ones who I really treasured, were in the area. So those friendships really stayed with me. So I will always associate Israel with deep and enduring friendships. And I think that those relationships keep me grounded and anchored in the state of Israel to this day. It's really all about the relationships, which fits great with our theme this year, which is Kesher. It's all about making connections. And with that, back to Rabbi Winaker.
So it's funny, I said, oh, glad you're back.
Yeah, so I'm not fully back. Just disclosure, I'm using my phone because it always helps to have some kind of backup. The internet in my house appears to have gone out, but I'm hoping it comes back shortly. And thank you for using this sort of opening question to continue to get to know each other. I'm sorry I didn't hear all of it. Let me just kind of go back to last week for a moment and say the following, which is that we had established that the Jewish story included the idea of going from no home, that Avram was asked to get up and leave his household and his birthplace, right, and his parents' house in order to be shown what would become the land of Israel. But he had to leave immediately because there was a famine. And so began this sort of like tension between the promised land and exile, and the question of whether exile was a good place or not. Clearly, Egyptian slavery was not good for us, but for the 140 years before slavery under Joseph and his tenure, it was pretty good. And for Abraham and Sarah in their first foray there, that's where they built all their wealth, so much so that they had to divide up from Lot. And Babylonian exile was kind of good for many Jews, especially for the rabbis of the great academies that would spring up and generate the Talmud as we know it today. And for us, right, instead of being second-class citizens or somehow more tenuously connected to here we go. Okay, the United States has afforded us a chance to be really fully at home, to be excellent. Okay, to be fully at home, full citizenship, and I know, as we said last time, that was not fully, truly true because of all kinds of quotas and whatever else in society. Our larger American project that, because this is Martin Luther King weekend, I will say, he masterfully used the story of the American promise, or the promise of American democracy, to be inclusive of more people than it had been, and that helped to bring more people into the civil rights movement. And frankly, to advance Jewish inclusion in addition to African American and Black American inclusion. So we are able to be fully home here in America, fully in exile, so much so that in the 1950s, right as Israel became a modern nation state, some American Jews said, we don't need Israel. Like, we're very happy here. Exile or diaspora is not a bad thing. It's a good thing, and it serves all our needs. So we have these sort of two homes now. Okay, so hopefully going back to my presentation, we can begin to look at not just this idea of two homes, but what those homes might represent in the kind of Judaism that they provide for us. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Judaism of being and the Judaism of becoming. Just so I know, can everyone see this slide? Yes, okay, we're good. So Judaism of being kind of follows some of the stories we were telling. It's about people and family. There's a tension in language. I called Israel a nation state, right? So the degree to which we have a political regime or in charge or government that's either self-run or otherwise established can tip into becoming. But like the idea of being so plentiful, so large a people, we can become a nation, right? We go from to goy, and we'll see that in the text in a little bit. But we treat each other like family, which is to say, you can marry in, and you're fully Jewish, right? Like, I know today we get into like intermarriage. Sometimes the person who has a different faith or grew up in a different faith or no faith doesn't convert to Judaism, but like, we still treat you like family, right? And if you do convert to Judaism, you're fully embraced. And so Judaism as a Judaism of being has nothing to do necessarily with race or with some kind of like strongly bounded sense of who's in and who's out in terms of behavior, because, right, like family, you know, there's an ugly duckling every now and then, or there's tension, but generally speaking, we seek solidarity. Okay, and we're going to see this in large part through the book of Genesis. And in fact, Daniel Hartman is working on a book, and I don't know if it's the first chapter, but he uses the idea of Genesis Jews of the book of Genesis as a Judaism of being, Jews of being. And it's unconditional, right? You don't have to be a good Jew to be a part of this covenant, to be a part of this Judaism, this relationship to God, this promise that we will be part of the Jewish community. It's just who you are, okay? And in many ways, that's a part of the narrative of being the chosen people, part of the narrative of being the chosen people. Okay, by contrast, there's the Judaism of becoming. Comes largely out of the book of Exodus, not the Exodus from Egypt part of Exodus, the Mount Sinai part of Exodus. So when it is that God says, I have high expectations for you, here are commandments, 613 of them, and I expect you to be a holy people, a nation of priests, and you have a mission of Torah and mitzvot, and by practicing this sort of moral behavior, right, you're going to be, as we stretch out in time, I'll show you the actual text sources for it, a light to the nations. Okay, so this is that part of us that's like, Judaism is a religion, it's not an ethnicity, right? Like, and throughout the language, it appears to be a conditional covenant. There's a big if. If we obey, then God will bless us. If we disobey or we don't follow through, then God will punish us, right? And in that way, it's about what we do. And if it's about what we do, then we're the choosing people. So there's the chosen people, right? We're acted upon. God chose us, period, end of story. We're part of the Jewish covenant. Then there's the choosing, right? I choose to be the kind of Jew that I am, right? Whether I start from inside the Jewish people or start outside the Jewish people, like either way, I'm choosing my Judaism. Okay. You know what, before I do this, questions about that kind of delineation, we're gonna see source material for it, but I just wanna make sure it's clear before I go too far. You seem like you're good with it. Okay, like I said last time, don't be afraid to interrupt me. So we're gonna start again, Genesis chapter 12, Lech Lecha, except this time, right, we're not gonna be focused on how it is that God is saying to Avram, go, okay? We're gonna focus on, right, I'm going to, Ve'esecha, Lagoy Gadol, I'm gonna make you a great nation. I'm gonna bless you and make your name great, you should be a blessing. I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those that curse you, right? But you, like, of all the families of all, and again, mishpacha here, like family, right? I am going to see that all the nations of the earth bless themselves by you. So the same text we studied last week to establish this sort of like going from no home to a home also establishes that Abraham and his descendants, truthfully, Abraham and Sarah and their descendants, right, for all time are part of this promise. So much so that, again, after the Egyptian exile, because of the famine, and they go back, they're so rich, Abraham and Lot have to divide up their groups because there's becoming conflict over possessions. And so Abraham thinks it's better for Lot to go his way and for Avram and Sarah to go their way. And God says right after that, look around. Yama v'kedma tzafona v'negba. Actually, it's not quite in that order. Just it's here though. It's tzafona v'negba v'kedma v'yama. Just, you know, if you like the song. But there it is. And I'm going to give all this land that you see to you and your offspring forever. Offspring here being seed, right? So to you and your seed forever. Unconditional covenant, everlasting. And it's about the family. It's about the generations. So much so that they'll be like the dust of the earth. Count the dust. And then your offspring will be like by the same measure of counting. I'm never going to like count all the particles of sand at Rehoboth, but you know, imagine it's going to be that big a deal, right? And so this is the establishment of the Genesis Judaism of an unconditional covenant, because God, for whatever reason, right, chose Avram and made a promise to Avram, right? And God's going to test Avram or Abraham. Will he offer his son? Even that, right? The promise is fulfilled generation after generation. And so to take it into like further literature, the Talmud, they take this verse from Joshua chapter 7, verse 11. And in the verse it says, Chata Yisrael, Israel sinned. Oh, what a fascinating idea. I mean, to me, it just seems like, you know, the next line in the story. But no, the rabbis to this, they're fascinated. They say, or they quote Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, from here it can be inferred that even when the Jewish people sinned, they are still called Israel, right? So like, wait a minute. When Jews sin, we're still Jewish. God doesn't write us off. All that stuff that we're going to read in Exodus and a bunch of
I thought Jeremy was trying to find the right word. Oy.
Still well.
All right, who messed with his Wi-Fi?
I'm going to have a conversation with Xfinity. This is, I've been doing everything I can to be with you. Okay, so I'll just see if I can add to the protection of our wavelength. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
And when did you lose me?
When you were talking about later, we were going to read more of something.
No, even if we.
Okay,
Yeah,
so.
Okay.
We're going to say this is in accordance with the adage.
Right, okay, so people say, there's a saying that Myrtle
Yeah.
Time to switch to Verizon.
Right, what he needs is like I have a tablet that if the internet goes, like it works on like a, the cell phone connection.
No, Surrey Park is notorious for bad Wi-Fi.
Okay, so
Well, once again, oh,
so I'm back again. I'm gonna keep trying. Here we go, and I've turned off more things in my house to see if that helps. The Haggadah, if you think that the Rasha, the evil child, is thoroughgoingly bad, it's because he says, what's this mean to you and not to him, right? He's excluding himself by making himself outside of this idea of Judaism as being part of that Jewish people. You're supposed to like knock him on the teeth and to say, it's what God did for me, not for you. And if you'd been there, you would have been left behind in Egypt, right? By contrast, when we talk about inclusion, I'm going to shift here to this text that's in our booklet. If it loads, the Tzitz Eliezer, oh man, the Tzitz Eliezer is the fancy name for Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the chief rabbi of a high court in the Orthodox community in Israel. Okay, case comes before him, and it's in your booklet, or it's in, here it is. Okay, can you guys, am I showing you?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
make it a little broader.
I will. Thank you for the reminder, Richard. I appreciate that. So, case comes before him regarding a woman who had Jewish parents, and she wanted the courts to allow her to return to Judaism because she converted to Anglican Christianity. She wanted to get married to somebody who was Anglican, and now she's expressed real remorse and she wants to come back. So what does the Tzitz Eliezer, what does this ultra-Orthodox rabbi say? It's obvious and simple that according to Jewish law, a Jew is in no way capable of freeing him or herself from the bonds of Torah and severing ties with the roots of his connection to his people, right? A Jew's fundamental to Jewish people is founded on the fact that he was born to Jewish parents, or more accurately, to a Jewish mother. Okay, we can get into the debate of patrilineal versus matrilineal descent, but like if you're born Jewish, that's it, you're done. Okay, and to kind of like extend it, a central principle of our religion and our Holy Torah is that no one of the offspring of Jacob can escape from it, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. Against one's will, a Jew remains a Jew connected to the religion of Moses with no recourse to free himself from it, right? She doesn't need to convert, right? This everlasting covenant is like forever. You want to be daughter of Abraham and Sarah, son of Abraham and Sarah, you are stuck with us forever and we're stuck with you. If you want to leave and go marry somebody who's not Jewish, we'll have you back anytime. You don't have to do anything special, okay? So, this is sort of the setup that establishes this idea of a Judaism of being. Questions on the Judaism of being.
I guess I'm being cynical, but what would that Orthodox rabbi have said if that woman had converted to Judaism, properly converted as an Orthodox Jew, and then decided to leave?
So interesting, right? And it's important that you said, I think, properly. So if by the standards of his community, she had converted to Judaism, right? Same exact conversation, same exact approach. Once you are part of the Jewish people, that's it, right? Now, if she had converted through conservative reform, or I don't know, if he found some loophole to say like it wasn't a good conversion, that's a different story. And the Israeli High Court gets into kind of some of that yuckiness, but for conversions that they have accepted, Jewish for all time.
Wait, my dad has a question.
Go ahead, Jerry.
As I recall, there was a story some years ago of a Jew who converted to Catholicism and became, I think, a bishop or a priest. And when he applied to Israel for admission according to the law of return, he was denied because he has actually converted to Catholicism. Is that a correct recollection?
I will be honest and say that I don't know. I remember the case of a similar issue where, again, what the law of return is complicated because it's sort of, again, the Israeli rabbinate representing the government. So I'm just going to sort of confess ignorance on that particular case. There's another case that's equally kind of interesting and instructive, where there was a woman who was born Jewish, who was up for sainthood. And the Jewish community claimed her as a Jewish saint within the Catholic Church. So there's a degree to which this is meant to be thoroughgoing, and yet there are kind of potential aspects it to get more complicated maybe than it needs to be. So again, Jerry, I don't know the exact circumstances of that particular case. My guess, though, is that if that bishop was willing to give up his Christianity, right, then he would be allowed under the law of return. That being said, there were plenty of Jews who were brought to Israel, particularly from the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union, whose Jewish practice or current practice, right, was not up to standard. And the chief rabbinate, the rabbinic court of Israel, has kind of treated those cases like en masse differently at different times. So sometimes they say they can come to Israel, right, but not be full citizens, or they can come to Israel as full citizens, or they can come to Israel, but they have to convert. And in order to convert, they have to be Orthodox in practice. And so again, I would just say, like, in reality, it's complicated, but on paper, right, it should not be. And we're going to get into some of that. Other questions on the Judaism of being? Okay, so partly in the interest of catching up on time and hoping that the internet stays, I'm going to go somewhat quickly because this is broad strokes, right? Like, we don't have to get into these particular texts. There'll be other weeks where we can argue about a text. Exodus 19, as I said, right around getting the 10 Commandments. We're at Mount Sinai. If you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possession, right? It doesn't say am sigula here. It says vayitem li sigula mikol ha'amim. So we'll be sigula amongst all the peoples. And here God wants us to be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Okay. Next text takes it right to the holiness code of Leviticus. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. We're gonna imitate God. It's not like God just chose us and that's the end of the story. No, we have to be as God-like or as in the image of God as we can be. So much so that when we get to Deuteronomy and Moses is reminding us of everything, we're told that we have to observe the law and study it and observe it faithfully. God made a covenant with us. And it wasn't just with our ancestors, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. Because you have to remember, in the book of Numbers, the whole generation that left Egypt and went to Mount Sinai, they've died off. So it's a whole new generation. And Moses is saying that covenant of becoming still applies to us today. And again, for future generations, because the text lives on. And closes the book of Deuteronomy. I set before you life and prosperity, death and adversity. You have to choose, right? If your heart turns away and you give no heed, you're lured into worship and service other gods, I declare you shall certainly perish, right? we're supposed to disappear. Now, do we actually? Like when we get to the book of Joshua and Judges and First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, every time the Jews do something bad, some people die, right? But then God sends a judge, a prophet, a king to help get us on the right path, right? So there's this back and forth, and we don't know whether we're operating under the Judaism of becoming, because we're being punished but not being so punished that we disappear, or the Judaism of being, because there's always a remnant of Israel that survives. Just a quick note on these sources, the Isaiah sources that showed back here. Oh, I didn't get to them yet, sorry. Here, these sources are not in your book. They're not in the source book. They're just, I added them because how can you talk about the aspirational aspects of Judaism, like bringing God's sort of vision of a better place for humanity, without mentioning this idea from Isaiah. I'll make you a light of nations. From the dungeons, those who sit in darkness, right? So we're supposed to, again, extend our Judaism, our message from God to the rest of the world. And almost kind of puts it really beautifully. You alone have I singled out of all the families of the earth. That is why I will call you to account for your iniquities. So like, again, we're called to this mission, right? But we're also going to be held accountable. It's a conditional covenant. Nehemiah, interesting. Anyone off the top of their head, besides the rabbi, tell us like Nehemiah's place in history?
He helped to rebuild the second temple.
Exactly. So the first temple is destroyed in 586. The Jews are taken to Babylonia in exile. 30 years later, Cyrus the Great says, you know what? The way I like to do things, go home and do it your way, but like, you know, pay me my taxes and we'll all have better peace because you'll be comfortable and I'll have what I need and I won't have to police you so much, right? So Nehemiah and Ezra go and kind of in tandem rebuild the temple, which becomes the second temple. And Nehemiah says, like, look, God has been amazing. Like this says like chapter 9, verses 6 through 31. It's in your book. It's 3 pages of the source book, okay? I excerpted a little bit. So here I started at verse 7, right? And God chose Avram and finding Avram's heart true, made a covenant that like to dispossess all the other peoples from Israel. And God kept God's word and God is righteous and God took note of our ancestors in Egypt and performed signs and led us by a pillar of cloud and brought us to Sinai and gave us the rules and made known Shabbat and other laws and gave us bread and manna from heaven, all this amazing stuff, right? But they, our ancestors, acted presumptuously. We were stiff-necked and didn't obey. We stiffened our necks in defiance, right? You, God are awesome. They, the Israelites, were terrible, okay? And because of that, we have to wonder, right? Does this still stand? Like, is what is going back to Israel and establishing the temple again going to work? And the answer is yes, because God is abundantly compassionate, didn't abandon us, bore with us, admonishing us, right? Even when we didn't give ear, delivered us to the power of other peoples. So the Babylonian exile was on purpose, but God did not make an end of them or abandon them because God is gracious and compassionate. So we have this idea that that really kind of puts out there, right? That even when we have gone from this idea of our 2 homes, I'm sorry, even when we're in Israel, where it feels like it's all about an unconditional covenant, we have this opportunity to recognize, right, that there's risk in being overly reliant on it, where we should be grateful to God because God allows us to, misbehave. All right, so let's see if we can apply this to Israel and to North America. And to do that, I'm going to use Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. A quick word about the videos for this week. As I'll show you at the end, the first 5 minutes of the first video, I think it's funny. It gets you a chance to get to know Daniel Hartman and to kind of feel what we mean when we say Judaism of being. The rest of the video is pretty much going through the sources as I just did. And then the interview, Micha Goodman and Michal Biton get into a conversation. And I'm going to touch on pretty much everything that Micha Goodman says and a little bit of what Michal Biton gets into. So Micha Goodman quotes Rabbi Sachs in a way that I couldn't actually back up exactly. But Micha Goodman's quote goes something like this. He says that Rabbi Sachs taught Israeli Jews are the chosen Jews and diaspora Jews are the choosing Jews. Okay. Now, it's definitely true that Rabbi Sachs talked about choosing and chosen, all right, but I couldn't find that exact quote. So Sachs uses this language of a community of fate, all right, for chosenness, and a community of faith for choosing, right? And we went, again, in this sort of Genesis to Exodus move, from an Am, a people, to an Edah, which is a community, a body politic under the sovereignty, right, with a constitution known as the Torah. But then he goes on to say, right, Israel, Jewish life, is a community of faith, of fate. And he gets into this, and this is sort of where Micha Goodman picks up. The air you breathe in Israel is Jewish air. People speak Hebrew. The radio has songs in Hebrew. It might have some American stuff, but like when they sing a song in Hebrew, even if they're talking about Gesher Halacha in Tel Aviv, right, an actual bridge, maybe they're also referring to Jewish tradition and how the bridge is also a path, right? And so there are all these biblical and traditional references in the language, and it's built in, and it's not just about today, it's about 2,000 years, 4,000 years of history. It's the air that everyone breathes. And the roads you walk are the roads where history for the Jewish people happened. Emek Rephaim is the neighborhood where the Hartman Institute is located. Emek Rephaim is where David battled many of his battles, right? It's not where he battled Goliath, but many of his other battles took place there. And the coffee shops that the Hartman scholars go to are on Derech Hebron and Derech Beit Lechem. So you can just walk. I mean, it's a long walk. You can drive. It's better to Hebron, right, where Abraham and Sarah, right, are supposedly buried. You can go to Bethlehem, right? See Jesus married, like Rachel is buried there, and or so they say, and Jesus, like the manger, right? Like history happened there. You live that place just by being in Israel. And the calendar, time is Jewish. Yom Kippur comes around, okay, maybe you don't fast, but everybody's going nowhere. So you ride your bicycle on the highway. Passover, maybe you don't keep exactly kosher for Passover, but you're going to go on a hike because that's vacation. You know it's a Jewish holiday because the majority culture is Jewish. And those aspects of life in the land makes it so that like you can be Jewish without thinking about it, or right, you're Jewish because you're Jewish, right? You're Jewish by being Israeli, okay? And again, this is sort of like, to stereotype a little bit, right? The secular side. There are plenty of religious Jews in Israel. There are plenty of different kinds of religious Jews in Israel. And one of the things we're going to talk about is like, when we make it just the community of faith, right? Are we doing a disservice to Jews in Israel or to people who live that kind of Judaism? And so Sachs, Rabbi Sachs, at the end of this quote says, it's equally important that young Israelis spend time in the Jewish communities of the diaspora. There they discover what what it is to live Judaism as a covenant of faith, something many of them have never fully experienced before. Like all our shlichim, they love coming to Beth Shalom because they're like, wow, I can do this Judaism. This isn't so like dati Orthodox, right? Like I like this. This is Judaism that speaks to me. And the same thing at our camps and when Israelis come to serve on staff, it's like eye-opening that Judaism can be meaningful and accessible and add a layer of depth, right? So we could say that what it means to be an Israeli Jew is to, right, be chosen, and that's the start and stop of what it means to be Jewish. And we could say that to be a diaspora Jew, North American Jew in particular, what it means to be Jewish is less about, you know, family or being chosen and meaning and spirituality to ourselves and to our lives. Okay, but what does that look like in North America? So Michael Walzer is a scholar of political theory, and he's very interested in this one idea as a Jew himself. He says, we're both American Jews and Jewish Americans. Like, we're the only people who do this gimmick of hyphenating ourselves, perhaps inaccurately, right? And so we want to be like American Catholics, right? Like, we're American, but we're Jewish, right? And so we also, though, want to be like, you know, Italian Americans with a hyphen. So we're Jewish Americans. So it's like we're part of this Jewish people who are now, you know, American. And he says the analogy doesn't work in either case. American Catholics are not all Italian. Italian Americans aren't all Catholic. And while Jewish religious and national identities do for us coincide, we're supposed to be kind of Jewish in both of these senses at the same time. And so it's like a false choice. It's a false choice. And that leads us to, yes, Philip Roth. Okay, so the gist of this, just to kind of give you it in brief, and I'll share the whole slideshow with you, is that like within every Jew, according to Roth, and he just says this so well. So like whether you like him or not as a Jew or as an author of literature, like set that aside. He says being a divided Jew is nothing. He says inside every Jew there is a mob of, oops, sorry, when I click it goes the wrong way. Inside every Jew there's a mob of Jews: the good Jew, the bad Jew, the new Jew, the old Jew, the lover of Jews, the hater of Jews, the friend of the goy, the enemy of the goy, the arrogant Jew, the wounded Jew, right? Every kind of Jew we have inside us. We're constantly arguing with ourselves, like, am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing the right thing? Is what, you know, so-and-so just did good for the Jews, or is it bad for the Jews, right? And we inside ourselves contain all of this dispute, incarnate. We kind of bring all of that tension into our own individual identities. And that's where, in terms of the conversation in the interview, in the first video interview section, Michal Biton touches on, she doesn't say it explicitly, but she talks about this idea that the Judaism is inside us. And it comes from a book called The Jew Within by the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Arnie Eisen, his co-author Stephen Cohen. They talk about like Judaism's become you know, so open in many ways and so personal that like one of the people they interview describes her Judaism as Sheilaism. She herself is Sheila, that's her name, right? And she's kind of made Judaism in her own image, right? And Roth is saying like, we've taken that so that like, not only have we kind of sometimes made Judaism look the way we want it for us to work for us, like a Judaism of becoming, but we've also internalized the tensions of whether that works or not. Okay. I'm going to leave this slide alone for a minute because this goes into next week. Pros and cons, and then let's just make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, Judaism of being, the Israeli version, so to speak. You belong, you're accepted. This is forever. We don't judge you for your behavior. We're going to tolerate all kinds of different sorts of behavior, and we're going to take care of each other. On the other hand, like, does morality have any sort of standard in that system? Not so much. I mean, maybe, but not because of what it means to necessarily be Jewish. And our identity is pretty thin. It's like what it just means to be in Israel or to be born to a Jewish family. And what we've noticed is that while that identity was thick for the pioneer generation, the early Zionists, those who fought for the state's independence, and maybe through 67 or 73, right? That was enough. But for people who were born in the 90s, the millennials and Gen Z, it's not enough. Millennials and Gen Z in Israel are looking for much more than like, yes, we built this country, right? Israeliness is not enough to be Jewish. And so is it offering continuity? Maybe, but maybe not. It does have the possibility of like, you know, having some level of elitism or racism, because like you're in or you're not, you know, you're part of the family, and it could also be insular. I'll be honest, I didn't make this slide, but I think it's instructive, and those questions do bear out. The Judaism of becoming, right, a thick identity. It's all about the depth and meaning of our tradition, and whether or not you keep it, and whether you argue against it, and it helps us to excel, to reach new heights. Many would argue that again, you know, even if you don't observe Shabbat or study the Talmud yourself, like you learned from Jewish tradition to argue, and so you became a Nobel laureate, right? All the geniuses of the Jewish community come from this sort of like tension that education is so important. It's not just like that you're born Jewish, you have to like do good for the Jews. And we actually ask you to behave well as well. On the other hand, the cons, well, it's your choice. You could kind of choose to let this Judaism go. You could assimilate, right? And if you don't assimilate, maybe you judge people as a good or bad Jew, right? And in theory, God could punish us for all of this. We don't necessarily experience that, you know, in our own mindsets or in history. It's an open question, right? But there it is. And so either we're going to fail or we're going to put up the effort. Okay, so let me stop sharing for a minute and see what kind of questions or comments we have.
Need time to absorb that.
Yes, that's fair. So, and I want to say this, that like, I skipped a slide that's going to complicate it one step further. One of the things that I want you to walk away with is that like, you know, it's helpful to explore each of these models separately. Part of the reason why I wanted to put them together is not just that my friend who's taught the curriculum before said I could, and that would help us get to a shorter, you know, overall course. But it's, I think when you put them together, there's something much more helpful, which is to say that at the end in the interview from the second of the two units, so unit 3, the Judaism of becoming, Danielle Hartman interviews Alana Stein-Hain, she would be a rabbi if that was the kind of thing that happened in the Orthodox world in New York City in which she lives, right? She's just shy of that, but she has a PhD, and a secular, a scholar, Israeli scholar of secular Israel. And what they end up talking about is that, you know, secular Israelis, like I said, this millennials and Gen Z, that they're looking for a piece of that becoming. They don't want God because they're not religious, right? That's still a kind of piece of the dialogue.
They're not religious in the way that people are religious in Israel.
Well, and that's just it. And the more they're exposed to models where Judaism is not just ultra-Orthodox or some version of a kind of right-wing orthodoxy, the more they're interested. But also, they are setting up secular yeshivot. They're studying Talmud because it's literature, the same way the Bible is taught in college campuses across this country. right? And I taught it at UD as literature, right? Yeah, it happens to mean more to me as a rabbi and as a Jew, but for the students in my classroom, it didn't matter, right? And so Israeli Jews are seeking that kind of interaction with their heritage and their tradition to create greater depth. And, right, as I've kind of intimated all along, this whole idea of like wanting to be a Jewish American, or, you know, an American Jew, like Jews in America, we've always kind of had this sort of like, yeah, we're a people, we're not a race, but this idea that we might be an ethnicity, that's really important. And I'm gonna like make it super clear, right? In the past week, Sheldon Adelson died, and one of the major things that he funded, besides the Republican Party, is Birthright. And what was Birthright's mission? Endogamy, Jews marrying other Jews. They're explicit about it. Michael Steinhardt, who's secular, right? He also funded it. They thought, get Jews from America, or around the world really, to go to Israel with other Jews, and they're more likely to marry other Jews. There's something about being in Israel and experiencing peoplehood, chosenness, right, as opposed to choosingness, that will help to kind of counteract intermarriage as it was worried about in the wake of the study of 1990. And yet, embedded in birthright system, I don't want to call it doctrine, but in the system is, if you have one grandparent who's Jewish and you're not, at the moment you want to go on the trip, avowing a religion that is different from Judaism. So like you could have been raised Catholic or Buddhist or Islam. You could be raised anything, as long as at the moment you want to go on birthright, you're not practicing that religion, right? One grandparent, you're Jewish enough to go on the trip, right? So it's very much the Judaism of being, so that you might go, right? But that boundary is so porous. It's like, you know, it's not necessarily like, oh, like super Jew is going to marry another super Jew, right? Because they're not in the good Jew, bad Jew system. It's just peoplehood. And so I think like in America, we are living both those models, right? And that's the tension we're going to have to play out. It's going to come up when we do our dual loyalty issue. It's going to come up when we think about anti-Semitism. Are we going to defend ourselves, right, by being strong and protective and insular and protecting our, right? Like, are we going to kind of set up more security cordons, right? Or have Israel be a stronger and stronger nation among the nations of the world? Or are we going to engage in interfaith work and try to somehow educate the anti-Semites out of their anti-Semitism, right? Yeah. And we're going to see that play out over the, I mean, we're not going to get to that until like 3 or 4 weeks from now, but like it's going to come, right? So again, even if this is a lot to think about, it sets up that whole dialogue. Marla.
I just want to say that I realize now why I'm so confused. Not by this. This is like making me, I feel like I've lived my whole life the becoming, right?
Right.
And my son being in Israel and may stay and has taken, this is really helping me understand this weird place I'm in, where a part of me has gotten closer to Israel, but a part of me also doesn't feel as, there's a little bit lost. And so this is an interesting, I know I'm not making much sense, but I feel like I'm between the two a little bit, and it's really helping me kind of want to learn more and get a handle on what is happening to how I feel about Israel.
And I just want to put this out there, Marla, that your current condition with Jordan in the IDF, I think, makes it clearer that it's so confusing. But my guess is that the majority of people in this classroom or on this Zoom are a little bit confused in one area or another, right? About our identities, about which piece speaks the strongest to us, or how we're going to resolve the tension. And I just want to say, right, the goal next week is actually to complicate it one step further before we start to see if we can reach some resolution. And so I hope you'll bear with me and with the curriculum to get to the end where we explore new models, right? The last 2 weeks.
You know, I also,
Let me just say one quick thing. I find it very interesting, but I'm particularly interested in getting to the dual loyalty because I have family members who are asking that, family you don't know, and I'm having trouble answering it.
Mhm.
I'd like to add that I think that this past election and, those people who, question me, you know, how could I not support Trump because he was so wonderful to Israel, really challenged me and my priorities. And I had to decide that I think morality has to play a big part in my decisions as passionate and biased as I am with Israel. The election shook things up a lot, and the conversations were very fascinating. I'm a true lover of Israel. There's no doubt, but it's complicated.
Right. And Lori, I'll call on you in a second. I just want to be clear. One of the things that this course is supposed to help us understand is that the people who are questioning you, Seth, and anyone else who's had that kind of conversation, they're trying to be good Jews, right? And maybe they're just coming from a different part of what Judaism means today in terms of our identity and how they express it. And somehow we're going to have to be some sort of Jewish community going forward, right? And the goal here is to be able to both listen and to be able to talk, to articulate either our confusion or our stance. Lori, and then Rabbi Beals.
And mine might be off topic in the sense that I'm not sure Trump did this for Jews and Israel. I think Trump was very aligned with the evangelicals who really want Israel there. They want a safe Israel so they can make their pilgrimage. They can walk down Villa de Rosa and all of those and go to Bethlehem and stuff. And so I just have to say, I'm not sure it's a good Jew versus not, because it not necessarily was for the Jewish people that Trump made those decisions. Sorry, I know it's off topic.
Well, no, and however right you may be, Lori, right? And personally, I happen to agree with you, right? And I think it's a really strong aspect of American politics. What the evangelical Christian community, which is now actually, I was just in a faith call earlier this week with the Religion News Service, and that we're now starting to call it nationalist Christianity as opposed to evangelical, because there are left-wing evangelicals, right? So it's a nationalist, both for America and for the end world and what Israel means, right? But there are Jews who felt that this was the Jewish thing, right? And that is hugely important to understand, right? That when Seth is talking, it doesn't matter what Trump's real motivation was, right? What matters is what we think of it, right? And there are plenty of people in the Jewish community, right, who think, right, it was really good. And it helped build up Israel and to set the stage for whatever these peace accords are with the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain, right? So we're going to see. Rabbi Beals. You have to come off of mute, yes.
Thank you. I try to be very religious about mute and unmuting, so my voice doesn't step on other people's. So I really did want to discuss Seth's thing because I didn't know he was going to say it, but now I feel like I want to touch on Seth fast and then get to what I wanted to say. It bothers me to no end that Jewish people get to decide for other Jewish people which Jewish values are more important, and that if Seth, and I would align myself with Seth, It's always a safe thing to do. Push values, Jewish values that come right out of the Torah as a preeminent, important place for it to be. And maybe nationalism, raw nationalism towards Israel as being a little less, it doesn't make Seth his rabbi any less of a Jew. And for people to monopolize the definition about what makes a good Jew, it's Israel right or wrong, and to hell with all the other values we taught you in Hebrew school, is really offensive. So I don't want to judge the person that puts Israel before everything else, but I don't want the person who puts Israel before everything else to denigrate you, Seth, or me, because we put ethics, values, not lying, being a mensch, all those values high. But that's not really what I wanted to say. I wanted to just tell a quick anecdote that was in my reaction, but I didn't do the anecdote because I can't type that fast. When I was at International House at Berkeley, there was a French guy, now a blessed memory, named Manuel Bronstein. And he said, in this French accent, you know what the problem is with you Jews in the United States? You call yourselves Jewish Americans. That's what you call yourself. But you know what we call ourselves in France? We call ourselves French Jews. Do you know why? Because for us, the Judaism is the most important thing. We happen to be born in France, voila. But we are Jews who are from France. But you, Americans, America is so important. You just happen to be Jewish. And he was really like laying it on. And then I said to him, you know, Manuel, I think, you know, Manuel is very right wing. He belonged to Beitar, which is like JDL in France. He experienced so much anti-Semitism and he never felt accepted as a French person. So it was the French country, it was the culture that made him feel that as a French person it was accidental. They reminded him that he was a Jew first. And I think that part of our identity here, in part, is how much are we accepted. The more that we're accepted in American culture, I think the more we tend to prone to call ourselves Jewish Americans. America, we're so grateful for, right? And we are proud to be Jews, but that's what we bring to the American table. Whilst for the people who are rabidly pro-Israel, pro-Trump, against all of the things, I think that they might tend to see themselves more as being American Jews because they're so worried about anti-Semitism. They see everything that happens to a Jewish cemetery, etc. They see so many threats. Israel is a great life preserver. It's our great insurance policy. And that we happen to be from America, but we're Jewish first. And I think what we've experienced, and I dare say generations closer to the Holocaust, are influenced in even a different way on the story. But I think your security as an American will help define if you think yourself as an American Jew or a Jewish American. I put no value on any of that and no judgment. I think it's based on the experiences we've had that we bring to the table. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, friends.
Yeah. So a couple sort of closing thoughts, and then I can linger a little bit if people wish, but I'm going to give permission for people to go. One, this is exactly the tension, and again, I promised I would kind of make it more complicated. So right, for Jews for whom security and the experience of anti-Semitism in particular has kind of made security and protecting the Jewish people paramount, right? Getting caught up on certain moral issues is problematic, especially when we get caught up on the morality of actions of the state of Israel. And so just like understand that that's part of what's going on, that Jews who feel really strongly about protection are nervous about getting into morality, and Jews who are focused on morality, right, are sometimes wary of what it means to put our identities first. And it gets complicated in this way, which is that when we elevate some of that morality to its own version of Jewish identity, right, when we go from the national and the covenantal as two versions of being and becoming, right, into cosmopolitan, being part of the global community, right, and talk about tikkun olam and social justice and universal application, right, then it begs the question, are we still Jewish, right? And how are we going to not just use Jewish phrases to describe our attention to those things, right, or our activity in those areas, right, how do we retain the particularism of what it means to be Jewish, right? And so next week is universalism and particularism. And so this Moshe Halbertal's kind of delineation, very helpful for helping kind of set that up. He also was a scholar at the Hartman Institute back in the day, and has published many books on philosophy and the Jewish community. The other thing I want to put out there is that as I was trying to say when I got kicked off the internet a couple times, Doniel Hartman wrote a piece about the lesson of the Israeli and American ways of looking at the Holocaust and its application to the insurrection at the Capitol. And I posted it on my Facebook, but I had it sort of only if you were a friend of mine. I changed it to public, so you should be able to access it just by searching for me. And what I say there is interesting is that, like, when you go to Yad Vashem, it's still there. The cattle car is off a cliff. It's untouchable, as if to say the Holocaust is beyond belief, right? But the United States Holocaust Museum, you have to go through a cattle car. It's like the elevator. And so the degree to which we need to know it, to live it, and to understand it, right? These are tensions that I think will be important as we explore, because we will, what anti-Semitism does and means to us, okay? In particular, right, when it comes to how much we attach ourselves to the Judaism of being and this sort of desire for protection versus the Judaism of becoming, where maybe we want to live a life of a certain kind of purpose, but at peace with, right, our neighbors. I will send out this slideshow. Again, most of the texts were in your source book, but the Isaiah text, the light unto the nations, were not. It takes a while for the recording to fully process and load, and then for me to put it onto YouTube and to give you a link. So it'll be sometime tomorrow. And I hope tonight has been meaningful in a very particular way, which I'm just gonna take us all the way back to the agenda. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy here. All right, my question for you to consider between now and next week comes out of the last interview from the Judaism of Becoming. And they end with this question, is like, you know, for much of North American Jewry, we tend to be attracted to the Judaism that affirms our own instincts. This is what we're talking about. Jews who supported the Trump administration, right? It's because of their own attachment to this idea of protection and maybe fear of anti-Semitism and other things too, right? I don't want to say that's the only reason. And for Jews who are focused on different issues, right? And the moral charge and to be a light unto the nations, right? We tend to focus on that part of Judaism. So how much of your personal Judaism affirms who you are or challenges you? And what I would like is for everyone to think about something that in Judaism that challenges you a little bit, right? The affirmation piece, it's instinctually easy, but the challenge piece is what's going to kind of help propel us forward through this dialogue. And with that, my friends, anyone who has to go, we've been together for quite some time, but I'll linger for a little bit.
One quick comment.
Yes.
The happenings of the past several weeks have really added a different dimension to my life as an American Jew, which is what I consider myself, and has led to some thoughts that I never had before.
Right. And that's just your Jewish identity. Your American identity, I'm imagining, is also, right? Let me rephrase that. My American identity.
My American identity, yes.
is now in question, because what it means to be American is to be, for me now, part of a country where the insurrectionists are part of what our history and our present tense includes.
Yes.
And I don't know that it will ever go away, but I need to acknowledge it and to live with it. And that means my neighbors might hate me. That's just me, right?
Jeremy, when you say what part of Judaism challenges us,
Mm-hmm.
explain that. I mean, I take it to just mean, I'm challenged to, believe in God more or observe the, mitzvot, but I'm not sure that's what you mean.
Well, for each person, it's gonna be a little bit different. So for some people, the idea that being Jewish means like that you have some sort of obligation to other Jews, or that like anyone who is a Jew is your brother or sister, that's hard, right? Especially in our divided political environment, right? But it could be hard just because like, I don't know, like you're just not comfortable around certain people.
So it's whatever we think, whatever we think.
Yeah, it's whatever you think, right? But like, and for what it's worth, right? The God part might be the challenge, or the observance might be a challenge, or the morality piece might be a challenge, right? Like I would love, this is me personally, I would love to join most of the protests that I hear about. Like that's just instinctual. I feel like I should be there. Yeah, but I don't. I read the news and maybe I'll sign a petition, but like, so does that make me a bad Jew? Like, is the prophetic tradition Judaism that I'm willing to take on? And personally, I've come to kind of like see my Judaism that affirms who I am and everything else is like about pluralism and creating a space where opposing Jewish voices can come together. That's where I'm like, it's both affirming and challenging, but being on the front lines of social justice is hard for me. And being on the front lines of like arguing against anti-Semitism is also hard for me, right? Those two pieces at each polar opposite of what we discussed today, they challenge me, right? So you can have more than one thing that challenges you, but it's like your story, right? And for what it's worth, I'm not going to ask you to share next week. I want to, kind of.
I've never experienced where I'm not going to say which side of the political spectrum I'm on, but I'm so disappointed. And I know both, whatever side you're on, you are. I think that's introduced a whole new challenge for us as Jews, as a community.
Yeah. Other comments or follow-up?
Well, that's true in theory, but in practice, I have a friend, Sephardic Jew, who I am friendly with because he's a Jew and we look for each other. But politically, he is just the total opposite of me. And we have had a difficult time, he and I, this past year, which is the time that I know him, to get along with each other, and we've struggled with it.
And this is another reminder too that like in the November election there was a lot about the Latino vote and how you can't just say Hispanics are all going to vote the same, because Venezuelans and Cubans are going to vote very differently, right, than Mexican Americans in Texas or in California or in Arizona. And even within those communities, there's an age issue, right? The same thing is true of Jews. We have Persian Jews and we have Russian Jews and we have in America, right? And Sephardic Jews for whom, right, social issues, they are small c conservative, right? And so they could go to either party. And there are plenty of Jews in history, particularly like the earliest immigrants from Germany and the late 1800s, and who ended up welcoming Eastern European Jews in the 19 teens. And by welcoming, in quotation marks, many of those German Jews would be what we would think of today as Republican, right? It's just that the Eastern European Jews fighting for labor rights and for welcoming other immigrants, like they changed like what we think the Jewish vote looks like, right? And the more we understand that what it means to be Jewish is complicated, right? The more we might understand each other, not just this group, each other, but each other as a broader American Jewish community.
Hey, Jeremy, I just wanted to thank you so much for doing this tonight. It's a complicated subject, and I wanted to say kol hakavod. I also wanted to say you had stiff competition because Senator Chris Coons was on the Martin Luther King program. I felt so torn. So I was trying to listen to both, but it made me really dizzy. One thing though, Chris Coons was quoting the Parshat Shavua for next week, which I thought was so incredible, that in terms of a Jew and identity, because it's a Christian audience and he was very focused towards his Christian roots. And as a Jew, I felt, right, going back to covenant and text, I felt so affirmed. So I sent that to Chris as a text and he loved that. So maybe he'll try it again next Saturday at our synagogue. I'll let you know. Anyway, I'm going to go, and kol hakavod to everybody, but Rabbi Winaker, you're the best. Bye.
All right, thanks. Yes, and thank you everyone for being here. I hope you
Thank
have a
you,
good night, good
and
week.
for keeping cool under fire. That is the hardest thing to do. So appreciate you not like just saying, forget it, everybody. I'm not going to do this.
Yeah.
It's actually a very Israeli thing to have the internet cut it in and out.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks everybody for coming. See you next week.